In the year 58 BCE, Julius Caesar marched 8 legions into Gaul, roughly 40,000 men, and he did it without a single refrigerated truck, without a single canned good, without a single modern preservative. Every soldier in that column carried his own food on his back, because the Roman supply system, brilliant as it was, could not always keep pace with an army moving 30 kilometers a day through hostile territory. Bread, the most obvious staple, was baked fresh whenever possible. But fresh bread in a marching camp had a shelf life measured in days, sometimes less in the heat and damp of a Gallic summer. Within roughly 3 to 5 days, unprotected loaves grew soft, moldy, and inedible. And a moldy loaf does not care how disciplined your legion is. Meat rotted faster still. Wine soured. But there was one item in a legionary's kit that could sit in a leather pack for weeks, sometimes months, through rain, through heat, through the jostling of an army on the move, and come out the other end still edible, still nutritious, still worth eating. Cheese. Not gold, not silver, not grain. A dense, salted, deliberately dried block of curdled milk that most modern people associate with a cracker at a dinner party. For roughly 2,000 years before refrigeration existed, cheese was not a garnish. It was military infrastructure. It fed the armies that built the Roman Empire. It fed the horsemen who built the Mongol Empire. It fed the Crusaders, the Vikings, the Redcoats, the doughboys of the First World War, and the American soldiers who landed on the beaches of Normandy. And today, you can buy a block of it, individually wrapped, for around $2 at a gas station. So how did a fermented, sometimes moldy, occasionally worm-riddled wheel of curdled milk become one of the most strategically important foods in the entire history of warfare? The ration that outlasted bread, outlasted meat, and arguably outlasted a few empires. This story does not start in Rome. It starts almost 10,000 years ago, in the hills of what is today Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, in a place archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent. Cheese, in its earliest form, was almost certainly an accident. Somewhere around 8,000 BCE, give or take, humans in the Fertile Crescent domesticated sheep and goats, and not long after, they began drinking their milk. Raw milk in a hot climate with no refrigeration does one of two things. It spoils into something dangerous, or it curdles into something edible. Ancient peoples, through nothing but trial, loss, and stubborn observation, learned to steer that process toward the second outcome. There is a popular legend, repeated in nearly every cheese documentary you will ever watch, that cheese was discovered by an Arabian merchant who stored milk in a pouch made from a calf's stomach lining, only to open it hours later and find the milk had separated into curds and a thin, watery liquid. The enzyme in the stomach lining, what we now call rennet, had done its work. Now, historians cannot verify that this exact merchant existed, and the story reads suspiciously like a folktale built to explain a technology after the fact. But the underlying chemistry is completely real, and someone, somewhere, in the Fertile Crescent, made that same discovery for the first time, almost certainly by accident, almost certainly using an animal stomach as a storage container, because that is what you had if you were a herder in the 9th millennium BCE. They did not know the word enzyme. They did not know the word protein. They were doing biochemistry anyway. The physical evidence backs this up, and it comes from an unexpected place. In the region of Kujawia in modern Poland, archaeologists uncovered fragments of pottery dating back roughly 7,500 years, riddled with tiny perforations. For years, nobody knew what these strange, holy pots were for. Then researchers found traces of milk fat residue baked into the ceramic, and the shape clicked into place. These were cheese strainers, purpose-built tools for separating curds from whey, meaning that by roughly 5,500 BCE, Neolithic farmers in Central Europe were not just curdling milk by accident. They were manufacturing cheese on purpose, with dedicated equipment, as a repeatable process. Think about that for a second. Before the wheel was common in that region, before writing existed anywhere on Earth, people were already engineering dairy technology. And here is the detail that made cheese different from almost every other food available to ancient humans. Fresh milk was, for most adults in the ancient world, genuinely difficult to digest. A large majority of the global adult population, even today, carries some degree of lactose intolerance, and this was almost certainly even more common among early dairying populations before genetic adaptations for lactase persistence spread through parts of Europe and Africa over the following millennia. But the process of turning milk into cheese, particularly aged cheese, breaks down much of that lactose during fermentation and aging. In other words, cheese was not just a clever way to preserve milk, it was a way to make dairy edible for people whose bodies could not otherwise handle it. This was not a side effect. This was, in a very real sense, the first food technology designed to solve a nutritional problem that humans did not yet understand they had. By the time you reach the first true civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, cheese was no longer a curiosity. It was infrastructure. Sumerian cuneiform tablets from roughly the 3rd millennium BCE record cheese production and rationing as part of temple and palace economies, meaning cheese was already being tracked, measured, and allocated by the state. The same bureaucratic treatment given to grain and beer. In Egypt, the evidence gets almost eerie in its specificity. In the tomb of a high-ranking official named Thomas, who served as mayor of Memphis, archaeologists discovered a solidified white mass in a broken jar. When they analyzed it, they found it was cheese, roughly 3,200 years old, made from a mixture of cow and either goat or sheep milk. It is, as of the discovery, considered one of the oldest solid cheese samples ever recovered. And here is the part that should make you a little uneasy. The same analysis detected traces of a bacterium associated with brucellosis, a disease that can be transmitted through unpasteurized dairy. Someone in ancient Egypt may have gotten sick from eating cheese more than 3,000 years ago, and we know about it because they were buried with it as a valuable possession for the afterlife. That alone tells you how much status cheese carried in the ancient world. You do not get entombed with garbage. But it is Rome where cheese stops being a domestic food and becomes quite deliberately a weapon of logistics. Roman military planners understood something that modern armies still understand today. An army does not march on morale, it marches on calories, and calories that spoil are calories you cannot count on. The standard Roman legionary ration included grain, usually turned into a hard biscuit called bucellatum, along with sour wine vinegar mixed with water called pasca, salted meat or bacon when available, and cheese. Roman writers, including the agricultural author Columella in the 1st century CE, wrote detailed instructions on cheesemaking, including how to press curds, how to salt them, and how to smoke certain varieties for extended preservation. This was not casual advice. This was a manual for producing a food that could travel with an army for weeks without refrigeration, because refrigeration as a concept did not exist and would not exist in any practical form for roughly another 1,800 years. Here is the uncomfortable logistics reality that most people never think about when they picture Roman legions conquering half the known world. An army needs roughly 1.5 to 2 kilograms of food per soldier per day just to function, and multiplied across tens of thousands of men on a months-long campaign, that adds up to an almost impossible tonnage of supply. Bread solved the calorie problem, but failed the shelf life problem. Meat solved the protein problem, but failed even faster, sometimes rotting within a single hot day if not properly salted and stored. Cheese, particularly hard, aged, well-salted cheese, solved both. It was dense in calories, rich in protein and fat, low in moisture, which is the actual enemy of food spoilage, and it did not require a fire to prepare, meaning a soldier could eat it cold, on the march without stopping. This was not about seasoning food. This was about keeping an empire's war machine fed across 3 continents, and cheese was one of the few technologies ancient logistics officers could rely on to do it. Rome's conquest spread cheesemaking techniques across Gaul, Britain, Iberia, and North Africa, in some cases layering Roman methods onto dairying traditions that already existed locally. This is where many of Europe's regional cheese identities begin to take root, quite literally following the road network the legions built to move troops and supplies. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers to the east, a completely different military culture was independently arriving at the exact same conclusion about dairy and warfare, using an entirely different animal and an entirely different method. The Mongols did not carry wheels of aged cheese in leather satchels the way Roman quartermasters did. They carried something even more brutally efficient, a dried, hardened curd called kurut, sometimes called arul, made by boiling milk, curdling it, straining the curds, and then drying them in the sun or over low heat until they became small, rock-hard nuggets, essentially dehydrated cheese pellets. A Mongol horseman on campaign under Genghis Khan or his successors in the 13th century could carry a bag of kurut that weighed almost nothing, took up almost no space, and could be reconstituted by dissolving it in hot water or simply chewed on for hours while riding, softening slowly in the mouth. This mattered enormously because the entire Mongol military strategy depended on speed, on horsemen covering enormous distances without the slow-moving baggage trains that weighed down conventional armies. A soldier who has to stop and cook loses time. A soldier who can eat dried curd in the saddle does not. Historians studying Mongol logistics have pointed to portable dairy products like kurut as one of the quiet enablers of an empire that, at its peak, stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, making it the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Bread could never have done this. Bread could not survive a single week strapped to a saddlebag crossing the Central Asian steppe. Cheese, in its dried curd form, could survive months. Meanwhile, back in Europe, a very different kind of dairy culture was taking shape further north. The Vikings, raiding and trading across the North Atlantic from roughly the 8th century onward, relied heavily on skyr, a strained, yogurt-like dairy product, along with harder-pressed cheeses to sustain long sea voyages where fresh food quickly became impossible to store. Norse sagas and archaeological evidence from Iceland and Greenland point to dairy, cheese included, as a foundational part of the diet that allowed Norse settlers to survive punishingly long winters and long ocean crossings in open longships, voyages that could stretch for weeks with no reliable way to preserve fresh meat or fish beyond salting and drying. Cheese was not the only preserved food the Vikings relied on, but it was one of the few that traveled well and did not require constant attention. By the medieval period in Europe, cheesemaking had shifted into an unlikely institutional home, the monastery. Monks, bound by rules of self-sufficiency and often sitting on large agricultural estates with access to abundant milk, became some of the most sophisticated cheesemakers in European history. And critically, they had the one resource that cheesemaking rewards more than almost any other ingredient: patience. Monastic communities across France, Italy, and Switzerland developed and refined many of the hard, long-aged cheeses that still exist today. In the region of Emilia in northern Italy, Benedictine and Cistercian monks in and around the 12th century are widely credited with developing the earliest versions of what would become Parmigiano Reggiano, a hard, low-moisture, intensely salted cheese engineered, whether the monks framed it this way or not, for one primary purpose: to last. A wheel of Parmigiano Reggiano can age for years, and even after that, it remains edible for a remarkably long time afterward, because almost everything that causes food to spoil, moisture, requires moisture to operate, and this cheese has almost none of it left by the time the aging process finishes. Whether every detail of the monastic origin story is historically precise remains debated among food historians, but the result is not in dispute. Northern Italy produced a cheese so shelf-stable that merchants were shipping it across Europe for months at a time without spoilage, and armies would eventually come to rely on similarly aged, hard cheeses for exactly the same reason the monks valued them: longevity without refrigeration. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expects, because while cheese was quietly becoming a staple of European military logistics, in other parts of the world, dairy itself was viewed with suspicion, disgust, or outright rejection. In large parts of East Asia, traditional cuisine developed with very little dairy at all, in part because of widespread lactose intolerance in adult populations, and in part because of deeply rooted cultural and culinary preferences that simply never built dairy fermentation into the food system the way Europe, the Middle East, and parts of South Asia did. When cheese did eventually arrive in certain East Asian contexts through trade or foreign contacts centuries later, it was sometimes met with open distaste, described by unfamiliar palates in terms that would sound almost insulting to a modern French cheesemonger. Meanwhile, back in medieval Europe, cheese had its own reputation problems. Certain Christian dietary rules restricted meat and animal fat consumption during Lent and on fasting days, and theologians spent real, documented energy debating exactly where cheese and butter fell on the spectrum between forbidden animal product and acceptable fasting food. Wealthy households in parts of Northern Europe could sometimes purchase dispensations, essentially official permission, to eat butter during Lent in exchange for a payment to the church, and some historians have pointed to these very payments as a contributing source of funding for certain grand cathedral building projects. And no, that is not something anyone made up for a documentary script. That is a real historical argument, debated by real theologians, with real money changing hands over the moral status of a dairy product. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, tracing the hidden histories behind the food sitting in your kitchen right now. And you will not want to miss what comes next, because the story of cheese as military ration is about to collide with two of the darkest and most transformative periods in modern history. Let us jump forward past the age of monasteries and Lenten dispensations into the era of gunpowder empires, colonial expansion, and eventually industrialized war. By the time you reach the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, cheese was a well-established, unglamorous, thoroughly reliable component of European military rationing, alongside hardtack, salted meat, and dried peas. Napoleon Bonaparte himself is often credited somewhat loosely with the observation that an army marches on its stomach, and whether or not he phrased it in exactly those words, the underlying logistics obsession was very real. French, British, and other European armies of this period continued relying on hard cheeses precisely because, unlike fresh bread, unlike fresh meat, cheese did not become a liability the moment supply lines stretched thin. But the darkest chapter in cheese's long relationship with warfare does not come from the battlefield. It comes from occupation, deprivation, and a government's deliberate use of food as a weapon against civilians. In the autumn of 1944, following a failed Allied airborne operation in the Netherlands, German occupying forces imposed a food transport embargo on the western, densely populated provinces of the country, in direct retaliation for a Dutch railway strike called in support of the Allied advance. The Netherlands, one of the great dairy and cheese-producing regions of the entire world, home to Gouda, Edam, and centuries of dairy farming tradition, suddenly found its own food, including its cheese, its milk, and its butter, requisitioned, blocked, or seized outright by occupying authorities, while ordinary Dutch civilians in cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam were left with almost nothing. What followed became known as the Dutch Hunger Winter. Daily rations for adults in the affected cities fell to roughly 400 to 800 calories, a fraction of what an adult body needs simply to maintain basic function, and people resorted to eating tulip bulbs and sugar beets to survive. An estimated 20,000 people died of starvation and its complications over that winter and into the following spring. 20,000 people. In one of the most productive dairy regions on the entire planet. This was not scarcity caused by drought or failed harvest. This was starvation manufactured by policy in a country that, in a different year, would have had cheese and butter to spare. The Dutch hunger winter did not just kill people in the winter of 1944. Decades later, researchers studying the children born to mothers who were pregnant during that famine found measurable, lifelong effects on their health, including higher rates of certain metabolic and cardiovascular conditions. Evidence that a few brutal months of engineered deprivation can echo across an entire human lifespan, and in some studies, into the next generation as well. That grim irony, a nation famous for cheese being starved of it by an occupying army, sits alongside a very different story unfolding at roughly the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, where cheese was being reinvented, not as a victim of war, but as one of its most industrially optimized tools. In 1916, a Chicago cheese wholesaler named James L. Kraft patented a process for producing what became known as processed cheese, made by finely grinding natural cheese, blending it with emulsifying salts, and heat-treating the mixture into a smooth, stable product that could be packaged, shipped, and stored for far longer than traditional aged cheese, without the same risk of mold, cracking, or uneven ripening. Kraft's timing turned out to be extraordinary. The United States entered the First World War the following year, and the U.S. military, faced with the same ancient logistics problem Roman quartermasters had wrestled with 2,000 years earlier, needed compact, shelf-stable protein that could be shipped overseas to soldiers in France without spoiling in transit. Kraft's company secured substantial government contracts to supply processed cheese to American troops, reportedly shipping millions of pounds of it overseas during the war. This was not just a business success story. This was the moment cheese, already a battlefield staple for millennia, got its industrial age upgrade, engineered from the outset for durability rather than tradition. By the Second World War, cheese had become a formally standardized component of American military rationing. Field rations issued to U.S. troops, including versions of the C ration, commonly included processed cheese spread, packed in small tins or tubes designed to survive rough handling, extreme temperatures, and months in storage before ever reaching a soldier's hands. Back home, the demand for military and allied cheese exports was so significant that the United States government rationed cheese for civilian consumers starting in 1943, alongside meat, butter, and sugar, redirecting production toward the war effort. Wisconsin, already the heart of American dairy country, dramatically ramped up cheese production during the war years, specifically to meet military and Lend-Lease demand, supplying not only American troops, but, through Lend-Lease agreements, allied nations as well, including Britain and the Soviet Union. Here is the detail that makes this genuinely strange to sit with. The same food that Roman legionaries carried into Gaul, that Mongol horsemen dried into hard pellets on the steppe, that medieval monks perfected in stone monasteries, ended up, 20 centuries later, packed into a small, olive-drab tin, riding in the pocket of an American soldier storming a beach in Normandy. The technology changed completely. The core military logic never did. Cheese does not rot the way bread rots. In a world without refrigeration, and even in a modern war where refrigerated supply lines could be cut off, bombed, or simply outrun by a fast-moving front, that single property made cheese worth its weight in something far more valuable than gold: reliability. After the war, cheese kept industrializing, but the story shifts from military necessity to civilian abundance, and here it gets almost absurd. Advances in refrigeration, pasteurization, standardized rennet production, and large-scale dairy farming after the 1950s turned cheese from a labor-intensive artisanal product into one of the most mass-produced foods on Earth. European agricultural policy in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly within what became the European Union, subsidized dairy farming so heavily and so effectively that by the 1980s, European nations found themselves sitting on enormous surpluses of unsold dairy product. A situation the press nicknamed, only half-jokingly, the Butter Mountain and the Milk Lake. Government-subsidized production had outpaced demand so dramatically that literal mountains of stored butter and cheese were sitting in warehouses across Europe. A bizarre modern echo of the ancient world's obsession with cheese as a stable, storable commodity. Except this time, the problem was not scarcity, it was surplus on an almost comedic scale. Today, global cheese production runs into the tens of millions of tons annually, with the United States, Germany, France, and Italy consistently ranking among the largest producing nations, and the global cheese market is valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Per capita consumption varies wildly by country, but in cheese-heavy nations like France, average annual consumption per person runs to roughly 25 to 27 kilograms, which works out to something in the neighborhood of your own body weight in cheese consumed by the average French citizen every couple of years, a genuinely startling image once you actually picture it. The United States, despite not having the same centuries-old cheese culture as France or Italy, has become one of the largest cheese producers and consumers on the planet, driven in large part by pizza, a food that, in its modern American form, would not exist without the industrial cheese supply chain built up over the 20th century. But cheese is far more than just food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. During the early 20th century, a material called casein, extracted from milk protein, the same protein family responsible for cheese curdling in the first place, was processed into an early plastic-like substance, sometimes branded as galalith, used to manufacture buttons, jewelry, and small decorative objects across Europe. In other words, the same molecule chemistry that makes cheese solidify was, for a period, quietly repurposed into an early form of plastic. Cheese science has also found its way into far stranger territory than buttons. Researchers studying the aging and ripening process of cheese, the same slow biochemical transformation that medieval monks were managing by instinct and patience 900 years ago, have applied modern microbiology to understand exactly which bacterial and fungal communities produce specific flavors, a field of study that has quietly informed everything from food safety regulation to, in a few widely reported experiments, sending cheese into orbit, and even briefly to the International Space Station, to study how the ripening process behaves in microgravity. Somewhere between Roman legionaries chewing cured wheels of cheese on the march through Gaul and modern scientists studying cheese cultures in orbit around the Earth, this humble dairy product never actually stopped being useful. It just kept finding new frontiers. So let us pull this all the way back. It was there in Neolithic pottery strainers in Poland, 7,500 years before anyone had heard of Rome. It was there in Sumerian temple ledgers and in the tomb of an Egyptian mayor, buried alongside him for the afterlife. It was there strapped to the backs of Roman legionaries as they conquered Gaul, Britain, and half the known world. It was there dried into hard curd pellets in the saddlebags of Mongol horsemen crossing the largest land empire in human history. It was there sustaining Viking sailors through brutal North Atlantic winters. It was there in the quiet stone cellars of medieval monasteries, aged for years by monks solving a shelf-life problem they may not have fully understood in scientific terms, but absolutely understood in practice. It was there, weaponized by absence, when an occupying army in 1944 cut off a cheese-producing nation from its own food, and roughly 20,000 people starved as a direct result. And it was there again, just months later, packed into steel tins, feeding the soldiers who helped bring that occupation to an end. From a Neolithic accident in an animal's stomach, to a factory-sealed tin in a soldier's field pack, to a research payload orbiting the Earth at 28,000 kilometers per hour, cheese has spent roughly 10,000 years solving the exact same problem for humanity, again and again, in wildly different centuries on wildly different continents. Bread could not survive the march. Meat could not survive the heat. Cheese survived almost everything, including us. Not bad for a food most people today only think about when they are deciding what to put on a cracker. If any part of this surprised you, the monks, the Mongols, the Dutch famine, the cheese in space, let me know in the comments which detail caught you off guard, because I genuinely want to know. And if you enjoy digging into the hidden history behind something as ordinary as a block of cheese, do me a favor and hit subscribe because we have a lot more stories like this coming, and I will see you in the next one.